Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to the Middle Ages. So, if you're already tucked in, lights dimmed, maybe a blanket up to your chin, good. You're in the right place. What we're doing tonight is wandering, very slowly, through some of the mysteries that puzzled medieval people, and, truth be told, historians for centuries afterward. The kinds of little enigmas that lived on in whispers, in contradictory chronicles, and in gossip scrawled in the margins of illuminated manuscripts. And, conveniently, some of these mysteries have only been solved quite recently, thanks to the slightly less glamorous but very useful tools of modern science. Things like isotope testing, ground-penetrating radar, and the ability to scrape a smudge of DNA off a 700-year-old bone fragment. So, let's drift into the first story. The case of the missing princes. It's probably one of the most famous medieval whodunits. The Princes in the Tower. Two boys. Edward V of England, and his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury. Locked up in the Tower of London in 1483. They vanish. And history spends the next 5 centuries arguing about what on earth happened to them. Now, in the Middle Ages, vanishing usually meant being stabbed by someone related to you. It was practically the family pastime among royals. But the prince's disappearance had such lasting power because it was wrapped up in Richard III's very short and very awkward reign. Here's the soothingly dull outline. Edward IV dies. His eldest son, Edward V, is technically king. Except his uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, steps in, claims the boy is illegitimate, and crowns himself Richard III. The two boys are quietly lodged in the tower, which was not yet the scary dungeon of pop culture, but rather a kind of royal lodging house with a built-in prison wing. And then, the boys are never seen again. People whispered. Did Richard have them smothered with pillows? Did Henry Tudor's agents do it later? Or did they slip away entirely? For centuries, the tower kept coughing up suspicious skeletons. In 1674, builders unearthed 2 small sets of bones under a staircase. Charles II, who had a knack for theatrical gestures, decided, yes, these must be the princes, and had them reburied in Westminster Abbey. The bones are still there, in a little urn, despite never having been properly tested with modern DNA. So, has the mystery been solved? Partially. In the last 2 decades, advances in genealogical DNA testing have allowed historians to confirm or rule out certain remains from the Plantagenet line. It's complicated because royal DNA is, unsurprisingly, a bit inbred spaghetti. But researchers have traced living male line relatives of the Plantagenets and Tudors. And the consensus now is leaning heavily toward, yes, Richard III probably did it. Not with his own hands, of course. That would have been messy. But the circumstantial evidence is strong enough that most historians are finally, sleepily, putting the case to rest. What solved it wasn't one grand discovery but the slow accumulation of little things, financial records showing the boys' attendance were dismissed, chronicles noting rumors at the time, and the very telling silence of Richard III, who, when pressed, had absolutely nothing reassuring to say about his nephews. Which, politically, is almost as good as a confession. So the mystery that haunted England for centuries is now mostly just a sad, unsurprising reminder that medieval succession politics were about as merciful as a brick to the head. The strange death of King Arthur, or, sort of. Not the Arthur of Round Table fame. The real historical one, if we can call him that. Medieval people were convinced Arthur was out there somewhere. He was less of a man and more of a please save us projection. For centuries, chroniclers wrote of a great warrior king who would someday return. Which, of course, made it very awkward when monarchs like Henry II were accused of being slightly less than great warrior kings themselves. The mystery that stuck for centuries was whether Arthur ever existed. His bones were supposedly discovered at Glastonbury Abbey in 1191. Monks claimed they had found a giant coffin with 2 skeletons inside, one male, one female, with a cross that very helpfully read, "Here lies Arthur, king that was and king that shall be." Which is, you'll admit, a little too on the nose. For centuries, skeptics rolled their eyes. Modern archaeology, though, has actually helped a little here. No, Arthur the once and future king did not exist. But the grave was not pure fakery. Glastonbury did, in fact, suffer a catastrophic fire in 1184. The monks were desperate for funds to rebuild, and producing Arthur's remains was essentially their medieval version of a Kickstarter campaign. DNA testing on bones from the area has shown they really did dig up ancient remains, but they belonged to various Iron Age and Roman British burials that were already scattered under the site. So yes, there were bones. They just weren't Arthur's. Unless Arthur was secretly about 5 different people from different centuries, which, given how legends work, is not entirely wrong either. So, the mystery was solved in the sense that archaeology confirmed what cynics always suspected: the monks planted real bones in a fake grave to raise money. Which, to be fair, worked. Glastonbury Abbey became a pilgrimage site again. The medieval equivalent of good marketing. Eleanor of Aquitaine's endless age. Now let's drift to Eleanor of Aquitaine. A woman who, to be fair, had so many mysteries around her that she could have funded an entire conspiracy podcast. She lived to be unusually old for the 12th century, well into her 80s. Which is roughly the equivalent of being 200 today, given the diet of wine, questionable meat, and plague. For centuries, though, people doubted her actual age. Chroniclers were inconsistent. Some had her born in 1122, others in 1124. Modern historians have leaned toward 1122, which would mean she was 82 at her death in 1204. This was considered almost mythical, as though Eleanor had single-handedly defied the medieval lifespan just out of spite. Which, honestly, does sound like her. Recent archival work, though, has quietly put this to rest. Charters signed during her childhood, combined with the dating of her marriage contract to Louis VII of France, confirm the 1122 date. Meaning yes, she really did live that long. No magic. No miraculous preservation. Just excellent genetics, a stubborn personality, and the privilege of being rich enough to avoid the kinds of diseases that took out most peasants by age 40. So, one of medieval Europe's great mysteries, how Eleanor managed to be both ancient and politically relevant, has been solved. She was simply ancient and politically relevant. Sometimes the answer is as boring as that. The skeleton under the car park. And of course, we can't drift past medieval mysteries without Richard III again. Because the man really can't stop turning up. In 2012, as you may remember, archaeologists rather famously discovered his remains under a parking lot in Leicester. This solved several mysteries at once. First, whether Richard had actually been given a proper burial. Second, whether he really had the spinal deformity that Shakespeare so gleefully exaggerated. And third, whether his remains could actually be identified at all. The answer to all three was yes. His body was shoved unceremoniously into a too-small grave, spine curved from severe scoliosis, and the DNA matched with living descendants of his sister. The man had, quite literally, been parked under tarmac for centuries. It's one of those rare medieval cases where the mystery wasn't just solved, but solved in spectacularly mundane modern fashion. Not with dusty chronicles or wild guesses, but with DNA swabs, isotopic testing of his teeth to track his childhood diet, and a municipal parking permit. Transition to part 2. And so, as we let these solved puzzles settle in, princes who didn't escape, kings who didn't exist, queens who were older than anyone thought, and a monarch parked under a Toyota Corolla, let's drift onward to the next cluster of medieval mysteries. Ones involving secret burials, whispered scandals, and occasionally, misplaced hearts. Victorian crime-solving traditions. So, we've drifted through medieval mysteries and their eventual solutions. Now, let's float forward a few centuries, into the damp, gaslit streets of Victorian Britain. This was an era when crime and policing began to look faintly recognizable to us. Detectives existed, though most Victorians still found them vaguely suspicious, like nosy neighbors who had somehow been given badges. Forensics was in its infancy. And, of course, newspapers were eager to turn every minor burglary into a national melodrama. But there's something gently amusing about how the Victorians tried to solve crime. They loved procedure, they adored gadgets, and they had absolute faith that a good top hat could command respect. Tonight, we'll take a calm little tour of those traditions. The reluctant birth of the detective. First, we need to remember that detectives were not universally welcomed. Britain got its first organized detective unit in 1842, tucked inside Scotland Yard. Just 8 men, all plainclothes, tasked with solving crimes rather than just chasing drunken brawlers through the streets. The problem was, Victorians thought plainclothes police sounded suspiciously like spies. A man in a bowler hat asking questions was clearly up to something. Respectable people muttered about un-English secrecy. Which is ironic, considering the same respectable people devoured serialized crime fiction about brilliant detectives with secretive methods. But the unit persisted. And slowly, the idea of detectives caught on, thanks in no small part to Charles Dickens, who was fascinated by the new profession and wrote glowingly about them. Dickens, of course, managed to make even debt collectors sound charming if he tried hard enough, so detectives got a bit of a reputational glow-up. The magic of footprints. Now, when we think of forensics today, we imagine lab coats, DNA swabs, and grim television lighting. But in Victorian Britain, one of the great cutting-edge techniques was looking at footprints very closely. Detectives would cast plaster molds of shoe prints, compare them to suspects' boots, and present the results in court as near irrefutable proof. Which worked surprisingly well, until criminals realized they could simply swap boots or scrape off the soles. There's a famous 1862 case, the murder of Thomas Briggs, a bank clerk, in which investigators relied heavily on shoe impressions. Briggs had been robbed and killed on a train, making it the first recorded railway murder. Detectives traced the suspect, Franz Muller, in part by the peculiar wear pattern of his boots. They even brought the boots into court, holding them up for the jury like some sinister version of show and tell. It sounds quaint, but at the time this was cutting-edge science. Imagine the solemnity: a judge, a wigged barrister, and then a pair of scuffed leather boots, dramatically unveiled as though they were crown jewels. The rise of the mugshot. Another tradition was the mugshot. The Victorians were obsessed with cataloging faces. Sir Francis Galton, a cousin of Charles Darwin, believed that criminality could be identified through facial features. He created composite photographs of multiple offenders, convinced this would reveal the criminal type. It did not. What it revealed was that blurry group photographs tend to look vaguely ghostly, which is not particularly useful in a courtroom. Still, mugshots became standard, not because they identified innate criminality, but because, shockingly, it's helpful to have a picture of the person you're looking for. By the 1870s, police forces across Europe and America had rooms full of stern photographs, each carefully labeled. Many of them show pickpockets who look remarkably like bored middle managers. Others look like they were having the worst day of their lives, which, of course, they were. Fingerprints arrive late to the party. You might think fingerprints would be the first thing Victorians leapt upon. After all, everyone has them, they're unique, and they're left everywhere. But no! The idea took decades to gain traction. The credit goes largely to Sir William Herschel, a British administrator in India in the 1850s, who began using fingerprints on contracts. He wasn't interested in criminology, he just wanted to stop people from wriggling out of agreements. Later, Henry Faulds, a Scottish doctor working in Japan, realized fingerprints could solve crimes. He even wrote to Charles Darwin about it. Darwin, being polite, passed the letter on to his cousin Galton, yes, the same Galton obsessed with faces. By the 1890s, Scotland Yard finally created a fingerprint bureau. The first official conviction using fingerprints came in 1902, when a burglar left his mark on a freshly painted windowsill. Imagine his despair, years of careful break-ins undone by one careless touch of wet paint. The not-so-scientific science of phrenology. And then there was phrenology. If you're not familiar, it was the belief that bumps on the skull corresponded to personality traits, including criminal tendencies. For Victorians, this sounded scientific enough to be irresistible. Phrenologists would solemnly run their fingers over a suspect's head, declaring with confidence that a pronounced ridge indicated dishonesty, or a depression meant a tendency toward violence. Courts occasionally allowed this as testimony, which is both hilarious and slightly horrifying. Phrenology lingered far longer than it should have, mainly because it gave people the illusion of certainty in a world where most crimes were solved through sheer guesswork. Eventually, it faded, replaced by real forensics. But for decades, Many Victorians genuinely believed you could solve crime by groping someone's head. Trial by newspaper. One cannot talk about Victorian crime without mentioning the newspapers. The press adored crime, particularly if it involved blood, aristocrats, or anything French. Papers would print breathless accounts of investigations, sometimes inventing details wholesale. This meant many cases were essentially tried in the court of public opinion long before they reached an actual judge. Suspects were hounded by mobs, gawkers turned crime scenes into tourist attractions, and penny dreadfuls turned half-true stories into serialized cliffhangers. Jack the Ripper, of course, became the most infamous example. The Ripper murders of 1888 were as much a media spectacle as a crime wave. Detectives were overwhelmed, theories multiplied, and journalists treated the case like a never-ending horror novel. To this day, the only thing solved was how profitable murder could be for publishers. The Victorian detective image. Interestingly, the popular image of the detective, calm, rational, pipe-smoking, occasionally insufferable, was shaped less by real Scotland Yard officers and more by fiction. Sherlock Holmes, born from Conan Doyle's pen in 1887, became the model. Readers believed detectives truly operated with Holmesian brilliance. In reality, most detectives relied on informants, long nights of stakeouts, and the occasional lucky break. But the tradition of presenting themselves as cerebral masterminds stuck. Detectives cultivated the air of mystery, even when the job mostly involved paperwork and bribing snitches in back alleys. The forensic oddities. We should not skip some of the odder traditions. For instance, corpse photography. When unidentified bodies turned up, police sometimes photographed them and displayed the pictures to the public, hoping for recognition. Which sounds logical, until you remember Victorian photography required long exposure times. The result was often a slightly blurred, ghostly image of the deceased, which probably did not help anyone sleep. Another practice was criminal anthropometry, pioneered by Alphonse Bertillon in France and adopted by British police. Suspects had their body measurements taken, the length of the left ear, the span of the fingers, the circumference of the skull. The idea was that every human body was unique. Which is true, but not in ways that are practical when your measuring tape is fraying and your suspect keeps fidgeting. Still, Bertillon's method was used for decades, until fingerprints finally eclipsed it. Gentle transition. So, the Victorians gave us detectives in bowler hats, phrenologists earnestly fondling foreheads, mugshots that looked more like grumpy family portraits, and fingerprint bureaus staffed by men who probably had no idea they were shaping the future. They weren't always right, of course. They weren't even often right. But they built the traditions that still underpin crime solving today. And they did it with great confidence, even when their methods involved plaster molds, skull bumps, and a complete disregard for modern privacy. As we let those gas lamps flicker out, we'll drift onward. Next, to something both softer and stranger. The peculiar world of royal childhoods that went wrong. Because, naturally, the Victorians weren't the only ones experimenting. Medieval and early modern parents had their own unique ways of producing fragile little monarchs. The Templar initiation ceremonies. So, we've wandered through medieval mysteries and into Victorian crime solving. Now, let's drift back again. This time, into the dim candlelight of a Templar chapel. The Knights Templar. Few groups have attracted as much fascination, rumor, and whispered conspiracy. Founded in 1119, they began as a small order of pious knights who were, at least in theory, dedicated to protecting pilgrims on the road to Jerusalem. Within a century, they had become an international financial powerhouse, a military elite, and the subject of 1,000 suspicious glances. But the part that really captured medieval imaginations, and continues to do so today, was their initiation ceremonies. Because when you lock a few knights in a stone chapel, make them swear vows in the dark, and tell them never to reveal what happened inside, people will invent stories. And, naturally, the more scandalous, the better. The setting. Picture it, a dim hall, candles flickering against thick stone walls, a handful of knights waiting in silence. The recruit, often a young man from a noble family, is brought in by two senior brothers. He's unarmed. His fine clothes are set aside. He wears plain garments, because humility is part of the show. In theory, the ceremony was simple. The candidate knelt, swore vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and pledged to fight for Christendom. He would then be accepted as a brother and embraced by the order. Straightforward, right? But simplicity rarely satisfies human imagination. And secrecy guarantees suspicion. The official version. The Templars themselves insisted the rite was a holy one. Candidates swore to defend the Holy Land, to live communally, to obey their master, and to renounce personal wealth. They were warned that the life ahead would be harsh: no soft beds, no private property, no chance to slip back into the comforts of noble privilege. If the candidate agreed, he was accepted, given the famous white mantle with the red cross, and welcomed as a brother. A communal kiss on the cheek sealed the bond, a fairly common gesture in monastic orders, meant to symbolize brotherhood. And that was it. At least, according to the official line. The accusations. But by the early 1300s, when King Philip IV of France decided he wanted the Templars' money more than their company, these ceremonies suddenly became the subject of very creative accusations. During the infamous trials of 1307 and beyond, dozens of witnesses claimed that Templar initiations involved heretical acts. Candidates were allegedly made to spit on the cross, deny Christ, or kiss other brothers in strange places, not just on the cheek, but on the navel, or lower still. Some said the ceremonies included worship of a mysterious idol, sometimes described as a severed head, sometimes as a strange cat-like figure. Now, were these accusations true? Almost certainly not. They were dragged out under torture, which, as you might imagine, produces extremely cooperative witnesses. But the rumors stuck. For medieval onlookers, the very secrecy of the ceremonies was proof enough. If you had nothing to hide, after all, you wouldn't be locking yourself in chapels and shushing everyone, would you? The real ritual elements. Modern historians, sifting through what records survive, can reconstruct the likely reality. The ceremonies were indeed closed to outsiders. That much is true. And they involved symbolic gestures, kneeling, renouncing worldly wealth, promising obedience. The candidate pledged to remain with the order until death, unless released by the master. He also had to answer blunt questions. Do you owe debts? Are you married? Have you promised yourself to another order? If the answer was yes to any of these, initiation could be refused. Because the Templars didn't want a man fleeing creditors, abandoning a wife, or double-dipping in multiple monasteries. The kiss of peace was genuine, but it was a chaste ritual kiss on the mouth, cheek, or forehead, depending on the region. Monastic orders across Europe used similar gestures. The trouble is, when you describe that ritual in the wrong light, it starts sounding very different indeed. The psychological weight. What mattered more than the physical acts was the psychological impact. Imagine being a young knight, stripped of your noble trappings, surrounded by stern brothers in white mantles, asked to renounce wealth and comfort forever. The silence, the candlelight, the gravity, it would have felt immense. The order wanted recruits to feel the seriousness of their vows. They weren't joining a gentleman's club. They were binding themselves to obedience, hardship, and possibly death in battle. The atmosphere of secrecy reinforced that weight. And, from a certain angle, secrecy also reinforced group loyalty. Once you had undergone the ceremony, you were one of them. Outsiders would never understand. That bond mattered in the field, where brothers had to trust each other completely. Why the rumors stuck? So why did the lurid rumors of spitting on crosses and kissing navels gain traction? Because secrecy breeds speculation, and speculation in medieval Europe tended to involve heresy, blasphemy, and inappropriate touching. It didn't help that the Templars were wealthy, politically powerful, and answerable only to the Pope. Kings resented them. Priests muttered about their independence. Ordinary people saw their castles and treasuries and assumed dark things were happening inside. By the time Philip IV launched his campaign against them, the ground was fertile for scandal. Accusations about their ceremonies were just believable enough, and just shocking enough, to provide cover for what was, in reality, a massive land and cash grab. The idol of Baphomet. One of the strangest allegations was that initiates were shown an idol, sometimes described as a bearded head, sometimes as a grotesque figure, later popularized as Baphomet. Some testimonies claim the idol could make crops grow or grant riches. Historians have tried, gently, to figure out what on earth this meant. Some suggest it was a misinterpretation of the Templars' reverence for relics. They did possess the skulls of saints and fragments of the true cross. Others point to linguistic confusion. Baphomet might have been a garbled reference to Muhammad, the medieval term for Muhammad, twisted into accusations of idolatry. But there is no solid evidence of any such idol. It remains one of those medieval conspiracy theories, like witches flying the Sabbaths, that told us more about the anxieties of the accusers than the practices of the accused. What we know today. Modern scholarship, supported by documents rediscovered in the Vatican archives in 2001, shows that Pope Clement V himself investigated the charges against the Templars, and quietly absolved them. The so-called Chinon parchment records Clement acknowledging that yes, some brothers had confessed under torture, but he did not find evidence of heresy. The Templars, in other words, were guilty mostly of being rich, independent, and inconvenient. Their initiation ceremonies were unusual only in their secrecy and solemnity, which, unfortunately for them, was enough to make them sound scandalous in a suspicious age. The afterlife of the myth. Of course, once a rumor takes root, it rarely dies. The lurid image of Templar initiates spitting on crosses and worshipping idols fed centuries of conspiracy. The Freemasons later borrowed freely from the myth, shaping their own rituals in part on the imagined ceremonies of the Templars. Even today, novels, films, and documentaries happily lean on the idea of mysterious initiation rites. In reality, the ceremonies were sober, bureaucratic, and a little dull, like most medieval institutions once you peel back the drama. But solemn vows and a communal kiss doesn't quite sell books. A gentle closing. So, when we think of the Templar initiations, the truth is a mix of the ordinary and the exaggerated. A candlelit chapel. A nervous young man renouncing wealth. Brothers placing a mantle on his shoulders. A ritual kiss. A vow that would bind him for life. No idols. No blasphemies. No scandalous secret cats. Just a ritual so serious, so shrouded, that it was destined to be misunderstood. And with that, let's drift onward. Next, we'll step softly into another realm of whispered history. The peculiar, fragile, and often absurd world of royal marriages that went genetically wrong. Because nothing says bedtime history quite like generations of cousins producing kings with jaws that could frighten horses. Templar castles and architecture. So, we've sat quietly in their candlelit chapels, watching the solemn vows of initiation. Now let's step outside, and look up, at the stonework, the walls, the fortresses that the Knights Templar left scattered across Europe and the Middle East. Because while the Templars' rituals were secret, their castles were not. They loomed over hillsides, bristled along frontiers, and reminded everyone that the order was rich, powerful, and had very strong opinions about masonry. And, much like everything else the Templars touched, their architecture became surrounded by legend. Some saw their castles as magical. Others whispered about hidden chambers, secret passages, and treasure vaults beneath. In reality, they were mostly just very sturdy stone boxes, but beautiful ones, if you have a fondness for medieval geometry. The purpose behind the stone. We might as well start with the basics. Why did the Templars build so many castles? Well, they weren't just monks. They were soldiers. And soldiers in the 12th and 13th centuries needed strongholds. Their castles served as military bases, supply depots, safe houses for pilgrims, and sometimes, unfortunately, as piggy banks that kings couldn't resist raiding. Templar castles were also statements of power. A castle on a hill was less about subtlety and more about announcing, yes, we're here, yes, we're wealthy, and yes, this is going to be very difficult to take from us. Hallmarks of Templar style. The Templars didn't invent new architecture from scratch. But they did refine existing styles into something that became recognizably theirs. Look for these hallmarks. Thick curtain walls, sometimes double-layered, making sieges a deeply frustrating experience. Rounded towers instead of square ones. This was practical. Square towers had corners that could be undermined or battered down. Rounded towers deflected blows and resisted collapse. Central chapels, because even in a fortress, worship came first. Many Templar castles had surprisingly elegant chapels tucked inside, simple but resonant with acoustics. Minimal decoration, they were not in the business of gargoyles and flamboyance. Their castles were austere, purposeful, and just intimidating enough to discourage casual visitors. The great castles of the East. The most famous Templar strongholds rose in the Holy Land and surrounding regions during the Crusades. Saith Castle, in Galilee, sat on a mountaintop 2,700 feet high. It dominated the countryside, with walls so thick that even determined attackers struggled. It also had a water system that impressed even their enemies. Sadly, the Mamluks eventually dismantled much of it, because if you can't have a Templar castle, best not to leave one lying around for someone else. Chateau Pellerin, near present-day Haifa, was another marvel. Built on a rocky peninsula jutting into the sea, it was so heavily fortified that it became almost impossible to besiege. Supplies could come by water, walls could be defended on three sides by waves, and the landward side bristled with defenses. Unsurprisingly, the Templars held it until the very end of the Crusader presence in the region. And then, of course, there's Croix de Chevaliers. Technically Hospitaller rather than Templar, but since people constantly confuse their castles, let's just mention it. It's a layered dream of medieval defense, a concentric fortress, wall upon wall upon wall, like an onion of stone. It set the gold standard for Crusader fortifications. The Templars, naturally, borrowed many of the same techniques. The castles of Europe. Back in Europe, the Templars also dotted the landscape with castles and preceptories. These weren't always grand fortresses, sometimes they were more like fortified farmsteads, designed to manage land and resources. In Portugal, however, the Templars built some of their most striking strongholds. Tomar, their headquarters, remains one of the most breathtaking medieval sites. Founded in 1160, it combined fortress and monastery in a seamless whole. The round church at its heart, inspired by the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, still glows with that peculiar mix of austerity and grandeur that was so very Templar. In Spain, they held castles along the frontiers with Muslim-ruled territories. These weren't just defensive. They were also staging points for campaigns, supply depots, and centers of administration. In France and England, their buildings were more modest, often urban commanderies with sturdy walls and a central chapel. These became administrative hubs rather than full-on castles. Still, their stonework had the same no-nonsense quality, solid, unpretentious, but quietly imposing. Secret passages? Now, no discussion of Templar castles is complete without addressing the persistent whispers of hidden tunnels and treasure vaults. It's true that many Templar fortresses had underground storage, often for grain, wine, or water. Some had escape passages, because if you're going to invest in a fortress, it's wise to include a discreet way out. But the grand fantasies of labyrinths leading to hidden relics of the Ark of the Covenant or the Holy Grail? Sadly, no evidence. If anything, the real treasure hidden in Templar castles was paperwork. They were meticulous record keepers. Archaeologists find account rolls, charters, and fragments of inventories, which, admittedly, are less glamorous than a chalice that glows in the dark. The practical beauty. What's quietly lovely about Templar architecture is how practical it was. These weren't castles designed to impress courts with gilded halls. They were built to endure sieges, to house brothers in relative simplicity, and to last. And last they did. Even after the suppression of the order in 1312, many Templar castles simply changed hands, to the Hospitallers, to kings, to local lords. Their stone endured, while their builders were scattered. Today, visiting a Templar castle often means standing inside a structure that has survived 800 years of weather, war, and neglect. The walls are still there. The chapels still echo. It is the people who are gone. Myths piled on stone. Because the Templars fell so suddenly, their buildings became natural containers for myth. A ruin in a field could be pointed to and whispered about, that was Templar. Who knows what they buried beneath it? And people rarely resist the urge to add drama to ruins. So over centuries, These castles became linked to legends of hidden treasure, of forbidden rituals, of lost knowledge carved into the stones. In reality, they were full of hay, horses, and slightly damp nights. But it's nice to imagine. A gentle reflection. So when you hear the phrase Templar Castle, picture not a glittering palace of mystery, but a fortress that was part monastery, part barracks, and part warehouse. Thick walls. Rounded towers. A small chapel with flickering candles. Brothers eating in silence in a stone hall. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't sinister. It was practical. Which is, in its own way, why they lasted so long and left such an impression. And perhaps that's the real irony. The Templars' castles were among the least mysterious things about them, open, solid, functional. Yet because they were built by men whose lives ended in secrecy and scandal, the stone itself became a screen for every legend. A gentle closing and transition. So there we have it, the fortresses of the Templars. From Portugal's shining Tomar to the windswept castles of the Holy Land, they remain some of the most solid reminders of an order that otherwise slipped into rumor. Next, let's drift onward into another theme. Not stone walls, but bloodlines. Because if Templar castles were built to withstand sieges, royal families were, unfortunately, built to collapse from within. Royal marriages that went genetically wrong. We've walked through the solemn vows of the Templars, admired their fortresses, and heard the echoes of their lost prayers. Now, let's change scenery, from stone castles to velvet-draped palaces. Because while the Templars were building walls to keep enemies out, Europe's royal families were busy building walls of their own, inside their bloodlines. Yes, this is the story of royal marriages that went genetically wrong. The royal problem. Here's the issue. Medieval and early modern royalty believed in two things very strongly. Keeping power within the family. Not marrying commoners. When you mix those two beliefs, you get a very small pool of eligible partners. And when you stir that small pool for centuries, well, you don't get genetic diversity. Instead, you get generations of kings and queens with increasingly creative jawlines, fragile health, and sometimes, entire dynasties collapsing under the weight of their own DNA. The Habsburg jaw. No discussion of this subject can begin anywhere but with the Habsburg dynasty. The Habsburgs ruled a sprawling empire that included Austria, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and a grab bag of other territories. Their motto could have been, "Why marry an outsider, when your cousin is right here?" The result was the famous Habsburg jaw, a distinctive, protruding chin and lower lip that became more pronounced with each generation. The most infamous case was Charles II of Spain, 1661 to 1700. Poor Charles. He was the end of the line, and he embodied centuries of inbreeding. His jaw jutted so far forward that he struggled to chew. He could barely speak clearly. His health was a patchwork of problems: epilepsy, infertility, and chronic illness. Contemporaries whispered that he looked more like a ghost than a king. The Spanish court prayed constantly for an heir, but none came. When Charles died childless in 1700, the Spanish Habsburg dynasty ended, not with a bang, but with a whimper, as if the bloodline itself had simply run out of strength. Hemophilia and Queen Victoria's descendants. The Habsburgs weren't alone in genetic misadventure. Fast forward to the 19th century, and we meet Queen Victoria of Britain. Victoria, who reigned for over 60 years, was nicknamed the grandmother of Europe. Through her 9 children, she married her descendants into nearly every royal family on the continent. This created a glittering network of alliances, and also spread a genetic disease far and wide. That disease was hemophilia, a disorder that prevents blood from clotting properly. In an age before modern medicine, it was a death sentence for many royal sons. Her grandson, Alexei Romanov of Russia, the heir to the throne, was famously afflicted. His illness shaped Russian history. It brought Rasputin into the royal household, with all the chaos that followed. Hemophilia also appeared in the Spanish and German royal lines, where young princes struggled with bleeding episodes from the most minor injuries. Victoria herself didn't suffer from the disease; she was a carrier. But her genetic legacy rippled through Europe like a slow-motion tragedy, weakening dynasties that once seemed unshakable. Madness in the blood, George III. Then there's the story of King George III of Britain, the king who lost America. George is remembered in schoolbooks as the Mad King. He suffered from episodes of delirium, confusion, and violent mood swings. Sometimes he spoke non-stop for hours. Sometimes he foamed at the mouth. He once shook hands with a tree, convinced it was the King of Prussia. Historians long debated what caused his illness. Some say it was porphyria, a rare genetic disorder affecting the blood. Others suggest bipolar disorder. Whatever the case, his condition worsened with age, until he spent the final years of his reign locked away, blind, deaf, and insane. His madness had political consequences. It weakened the monarchy, gave more power to Parliament, and shaped Britain's path toward constitutional rule. All because the king's blood, or brain chemistry, betrayed him. The Bourbon Blues. In France, the Bourbons also dabbled a little too much in cousinly affection. Generations of intermarriage led to fragile health and weak rulers. Louis XIV, the Sun King, seemed strong, but his heirs were not. The Bourbon bloodline carried tuberculosis, smallpox susceptibility, and a general tendency toward early death. His great-grandson, Louis XV, inherited the throne as a child because almost everyone between him and the crown had died of disease. By the time of the French Revolution, the monarchy was already brittle. The guillotine didn't topple a dynasty at its height of vigor, it finished off one that centuries of selective inbreeding had already hollowed out. The Russian Romanovs. The Romanovs, meanwhile, illustrate how one genetic thread can unravel a dynasty. As mentioned earlier, Alexei Romanov, son of Nicholas II and Alexandra, suffered from hemophilia, courtesy of Queen Victoria's gene. His illness brought despair to his parents, who turned in desperation to Grigory Rasputin, a wandering mystic. Rasputin promised he could heal the boy. Whether by hypnosis, prayer, or sheer confidence, he sometimes seemed to help. Alexandra became convinced he was divinely sent. The court, however, saw him as a charlatan. His growing influence poisoned the monarchy's reputation. So when the Russian Revolution erupted, the royal family was already discredited. And at the root of it all was a genetic flaw, a single broken protein in the bloodline of Europe's most royal family. Why didn't they stop? At this point, you might be asking, why didn't royals just stop marrying their cousins? The answer is complicated. Politics, marriages were political alliances, not love stories. Keeping bloodlines pure was seen as keeping power pure. Suspicion of outsiders, marrying foreign princes could invite claims to the throne, or worse, wars. Tradition, for centuries, intermarriage worked, or at least seemed to. By the time genetic consequences appeared, it was too late. In short, they didn't understand heredity. What they did understand was that marrying the girl next door was not an option when you were king. A gentle reflection. Looking back, it's hard not to feel a little sympathy. These were people trapped by their crowns, forced into marriages chosen by councils and treaties, not by affection. The result was not just unhappy unions, but entire bloodlines weighed down by hidden flaws. The Habsburgs collapsed in Spain. The Romanovs bled in Russia. The Bourbons faltered in France. All fell, in part, because of their own family trees. There's a lesson in there somewhere. Perhaps that power preserved too tightly eventually withers. Or that you should occasionally marry outside your immediate gene pool. Which is good advice, whether you're a monarch or not. A gentle closing in transition. So, that is the quiet tragedy of Europe's royal genetics. Thrones toppled not just by war, but by the biology of fragile heirs and inherited madness. Next, we'll dim the lights and turn to a darker subject. The occult symbols hidden in medieval art. Because while kings were collapsing from the inside, artists were busy hiding messages in paint and stone.